Will there be justice for war crimes committed in Gaza? With more than 15,000 killed, many of them children, dozens of them journalists, legal cases have been filed against leaders in Israel and the U.S. But can the system provide justice against states who refuse to abide by their rulings? Or are these leaders untouchable through international law? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. Legal action has been taken before and failed, but never has the scale of destruction been as horrific as what we've seen in Gaza since October 7th. As a result, multiple nations and organizations have filed legal cases against leaders in Israel and the United States for crimes including genocide and apartheid. Now, time and time again, the world has witnessed impunity when it comes to prosecuting the most powerful. But in the face of overwhelming evidence, could it be different this time? Here's a look now at the international litigation underway.
The people of Gaza are in the midst of an epic humanitarian catastrophe before the eyes of the world. We must not look away.
Israel has killed more than 15,000 Palestinians. Many of them are children. Nearly 80% of Gaza's population has been displaced. The Israeli army has targeted hospitals, schools, places of worship, and refugee camps. For weeks, Israel had blocked medical supplies, food, water, and fuel from entering the besieged strip. Calls for the International Criminal Court to hold Israel accountable and arrest Prime Minister Netanyahu are growing louder.
We wanted to let the ICC know that we support the people in Gaza and that we want that Netanyahu one day comes to this court to be punished here.
And the cases before the court are piling up. 5 countries have asked the ICC for a war crimes investigation in Palestine. Reporters Without Borders filed a lawsuit accusing Israel of committing war crimes against Palestinian journalists in Gaza. In 2 separate complaints, 3 Palestinian rights groups and a group of lawyers acting for Palestinian victims have urged The Hague to include genocide in the inquiry.
We are here, first of all, as lawyers for the court, for the prosecutor, to tell him that we have seen what has happened and that it justifies a complaint of genocide. But we are also here for the Palestinians to tell them that you now have an army of lawyers.
ICC prosecutor Karim Khan has pointed to the ongoing investigation which began in 2021 into war crimes committed in the Palestinian territories from 2014 onwards. He says the current conflicts falls within its scope.
We're independently looking at the situation in Palestine, and we need to make sure the law is on the front lines and the law is seen to ameliorate the suffering of so many.
But since 2021, there has been little progress in that investigation. Israel is not a member of the ICC. It refuses to cooperate with the prosecutor and refuses to allow court members access to Israel and Palestine in order to collect evidence. US President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are also facing a federal lawsuit for failing to prevent an unfolding genocide in Gaza. Washington immediately pledged unwavering support for Israel following the October 7 attacks. It already sends an annual $3.8 billion in military aid. Like Israel, the US is also not a member of the ICC, but it is a signatory of the Genocide Convention. Palestinians and human rights organizations filed the case, saying the US is complicit in Israel's crimes.
That is such a serious crime that states are obligated to take all measures within their control, all measures possible, from the minute they learn of the possibility of genocide, to stop that. We have not seen the United States do that.
Accountability for Israel and the US is definitely a long shot, but many hope a strong position from the ICC may deter war crimes and give hope to the Palestinians awaiting justice.
So will or can there be any legal consequences for war crimes committed in Gaza? Joining me now to discuss that are from Washington, Khaled Elgindy, the director of the Palestine program at the Middle East Institute and author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. From Staten Island, New York, is Tom O'Connor. He's the senior foreign policy writer for Newsweek magazine. And in Maryland, Palestinian journalist Laila el Haddad. She's also one of the plaintiffs in a lawsuit against U.S. President Joe Biden for crimes in Gaza. Thanks all so much for being with me. Laila, I'll start with you because I need you to tell us about this legal action that you have taken. You're not appealing to international courts here. You and several other parties are instead suing U.S. leaders for complicity in genocide. So what led you to choose this strategy, if I can call it that, and what are you hoping will happen?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having us on the show. I felt that I was obligated as not only a Palestinian, but also an American citizen and one who has been directly impacted by this conflict. I, like many others, of course, am not unique in this regard. I've had several direct family members who have tragically been killed by Israeli forces, my aunt and several of my adult cousins and their families, as well as over 45 members of my extended family in southern Gaza. And I promised myself and I promised them that I would do everything in my capacity as an American citizen to hold my government accountable, specifically Joe Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd, for failing to prevent an ongoing genocide in Gaza, where they had the means and power and influence to do so, an obligation, of course, under the International Convention Against Genocide.
You also mentioned, and I found this so interesting, is that, the taxes you've paid have actually funded the killing of your own family members. So you really do feel that there is almost a financial connection as well between the U.S. government. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not, I get chills every time a family member or a friend in Gaza sends me, those who have survived, of course, sends me a picture of a shell that was used to kill their neighbors or their friends. And it says on there, made in the USA. I really don't know what to say. I'm almost embarrassed at a certain point to tell them that it's my government here and my tax dollars that are harming you and that have killed several of my own family members.
Unbelievable. Khaled, let me come to you. Do you think in this case, perhaps, lawsuits could be more effective here? Or do you still have some faith in the international legal system to hold people to account?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really speak to the legal dimension of it. I think it's important what Laila and her family are trying to push. I think the administration and the American public need to understand what is happening with U.S. tax dollars and how they're being used. And even if it doesn't achieve a judicial outcome that is satisfactory, I think there's still value in pursuing that kind of an action for raising awareness among the public, who the vast majority of Americans don't know what's happening in Gaza or in Palestine, or that it's happening with the active support of the United States. So in and of itself, I think it's important. On the international scene, it's very hard to say. We know that the ICC, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, has visited Rafah, at least the border from the Egyptian side. He was not allowed to enter at that time. So we know that there's an ongoing investigation. We know that it includes what is happening now, but it's likely it's going to take some time before we know that there's any possibility of something like indictments, for example. But let me just also say that the accountability more broadly is crucial, not only from a moral and legal standpoint, but from a stability standpoint, because this is the lack of accountability is actually what is fueling the violence, because Israel, as the far more powerful party, feels that it can continuously escalate the kinds of violence that we're seeing.
Right.
We're seeing record numbers of civilians being killed in a conflict, in large part because there's no accountability.
And that's what makes this cycle so frustrating, is that it builds on itself, and it sets the lack of precedent, for more people to understand that there really are no consequences. But Tom, let me ask you, you've been tracking litigation in international courts. Many have pointed out that the system was highly responsive when plaintiffs went after Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine, but cases against Netanyahu, for example, won't see that swift action, and not just because Israel is not a signatory to the ICC.
Certainly, yeah. And I think this gets to one of those blind spots that we've seen when it comes to international law, a very big blind spot when it comes to going after powerful and influential nations, be it even Russia to an extent, because, yes, we see the warrant for Vladimir Putin, but as far as any action being taken on that is very unlikely, in my opinion. The same goes for the United States. We saw ICC action proceedings starting against the United States for some time when it came to allegations of war crimes in Afghanistan. The U.S. threatened sanctions against the ICC, and the U.S. has gone out of its way, especially when it comes to Israel, to say that it will not tolerate any international investigations of its allies. So I would imagine a similar situation in this case. And when it comes to domestic, proceedings, it's very rare, of course, that a domestic judicial process weighs it on foreign policy. But the Center for Constitutional Rights has a record here. We saw it in Guantanamo Bay back in, I believe it was 2004 and 2008 for habeas corpus. So I think it does, as Khaled said, add to the pressure from within. Of course, it warrants saying that there is also a lot of significant pressure coming from the other side, saying Israel has to do more, the U.S. has to do more to protect Israel. So, especially now that it's an election year, it's a very difficult time for Biden to weigh in on this.
It's interesting, though, Tom, let me stick with you for a second to see how, South Africa is now the lead plaintiff in making an appeal to the ICC to take action against Netanyahu when it previously so harshly criticized the ICC and refused to arrest Sudan's Omar al-Bashir under an ICC warrant, even though it was a signatory. But do you get the feeling that this is maybe a test of a country like South Africa and the others to see if the ICC will actually take action against others that are not from the global South?
Yeah, absolutely. And look at the controversy that was caused when it came to BRICS summit and Putin potentially traveling there under a warrant. And again, this is whether, no matter who you support in either conflict, it's just a matter of international law. What we see is much more often than this law being applied across the board is that it becomes sort of a geopolitical tool or a tool of existing foreign policy. And again, that goes to the United States. It is a test to see if there are truly non-aligned, neutral processes out there and actors willing to execute those processes. So far, the record is not great. We have seen most of this international action being taken against countries that are not powerful enough to defend themselves or exert influence over international institutions. So yes, I think it is certainly a test. But as far as the track record goes, it's not a very good one right now. Whether that'll change, it'll be difficult to say. The U.S., as I said before, I think will use all of its power to block any international processes while trying to pursue its own path towards steering Israeli foreign policy and military policy in one way or another.
So, Laila, let me ask you. I mean, having heard that, what are your realistic expectations here? Not just on the legal action you've taken via this lawsuit, but on all fronts, including in the international courts?
I think, as Khaled said, first and foremost, the objective is to try to obviously raise awareness and bring this on the radar, especially of those who might not be as familiar with what's going on. And I think it's just such a gross violation. So, it's so harrowing what's going on, and the worst, I would say, I think by any accounts, onslaught against civilians, at least in the last decade. And, I was doing the calculations myself, and more children have been killed in these 50-odd days by Israel than have been killed in 6 years of war in Syria. I mean, just in the UN obviously has referred to Gaza now as a graveyard for children. The legal objective, of course, is to get the courts to bar the United States from providing weapons, diplomatic cover, and money to Israel, and to press Israel to immediately cease the killing of Palestinians, to stop its war on Gaza, to lift the siege on Gaza, and to stop also the mass expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza, which we see again now recurring with these new flyers my cousin just sent me just a short while ago that have been sent down over Palestinians in the south, telling them now to go even further. So this is, in short, what we want to accomplish.
Indeed. You know, Khaled, though, there seems to be this kind of catch-22 here, because you have to take some action. You have to do something, because we need people to know that there will be consequences and that you can't just disobey all international law so flagrantly and just get away with it. But then the catch-22 is that actually the example that is set through these courts is that there is no accountability. There are no consequences. So what are you left to do?
Well, I think it's no secret that the international system is broken. The United Nations and other institutions, the Security Council, for example, the mission of the Security Council is to intervene in situations exactly like what we're seeing now, and it hasn't. The Security Council is completely paralyzed in large part because of the United States and UK vetoes. They don't want to move toward the ceasefire, which is actually kind of alarming if you imagine that they all say they're interested in a peace process, but are actually quite enthusiastically supporting a war process. So the institutions in general aren't functioning as they're supposed to. And I think the ICC and ICJ, the International Court of Justice, are not immune from that. They are politicized institutions like the Security Council to one degree or another, and they are susceptible to pressure from powerful nations like the United States.
Yeah. You know, Tom, many people just can't accept that this can happen and that there can be no accountability. So if it doesn't come through, if the justice and the accountability doesn't come through these international courts or these lawsuits even, could we see sanctions in some way to compensate? Or what would happen if the U.S. was finally forced to drop its military support for Israel, or bring about support for something like boycott, divest, and sanction movement?
Well, I think that, you know, there's these processes, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, and Israel across various administrations sort of take on their own patterns, where we see, open support for Israel in the very beginning, whatever Israel wants, and then as time goes on, the conflict continues. There is some sort of mediation process begun. I think what's different about this time is that we're sort of in an uncontrolled, unlimited situation right now. There aren't the clear, defined aims of the conflict. Israel, of course, shows no sign of wanting to end this conflict unless Hamas is totally defeated. They've said it could take weeks or months or years even. So it's a little different. It's perhaps very different than previous instances. And the Biden administration right now is struggling to find its voice on this, to how far it wants to go. To tell Israel that it has to limit certain areas. I was on the phone with the White House, I think this was last week now, and a White House official had said that, we don't support Israel moving into the south of Gaza unless there are more civilian protection measures taken. Now, if Israel goes ahead and does that without taking those measures, it's difficult for me to see whether the U.S. will be able to enforce that and actually say, no, we don't support that. I know there's been some reporting about some back and forth between U.S. and Israeli officials, but when it comes to the public stance, how far is the U.S. willing to go? Now, when it comes to the domestic side of things, if we stick on that for a minute, there are congressional processes, of course. We saw that with Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen, the war powers resolution. But of course, Biden gets the final say on much of that, unless there's a significant amount of congressional support. And I just don't think we're there yet, though I know that there are, I think Senator Bernie Sanders, some other lawmakers are looking to explore that route.
Yeah. Laila, one of the Israeli arguments is that there is this symmetry here in what happened on October 7th and how Israel is now, what it says, defending itself. So do you worry that, any cases against Israel and the U.S. would only be as strong as cases that they think they're building against Hamas?
I mean, the problem is with this self-defense argument is that it has no end or no limit, right? It results in a sort of forever war situation, and it bears reminding. I mean, none of us here obviously need reminding, but maybe to the viewership and more generally, maybe the purpose of these lawsuits is that this didn't begin and end on October 7th. At least for the Palestinians, this has been ongoing for decades upon decades, right? That they have been enduring violent and systematic occupation and oppressive apartheid rule. And if we're speaking about Gaza more specifically, 16 plus years of suffocating blockade, the chokehold of which has gotten tighter and tighter over the years, separating Palestinians there completely from other Palestinians, not only in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and of course, putting a complete block on the entry and exit, basically a control over the movement, not only of people, but of goods. I think over 75% of the population of Gaza is under the age of 25. And it's very unlikely that they would have ever left Gaza to start. So again, it's sort of a very myopic view or standpoint, in my opinion, and it has to have its limits. I mean, if we're just talking about, I was just listening earlier to what Blinken had said about Israel. I mean, you were saying it was a catch-22. It's also, the whole thing is very dystopian. Blinken last night said, on one hand, well, yes, Israel will allow them to prosecute this war as long as they minimize civilian casualties. And he said they have the means and the know-how and the technology to do so. Really? They do? So how do you explain the overwhelmingly civilian fatalities then? Does that mean they did those things intentionally? I mean, yes, in my opinion, of course they did, right? They are systematically targeting not only knowingly, according to this recent article on 972 magazine, but also, and this has been documented by the United Nations, systematically targeting both the civilian infrastructure and civilian infrastructure and agricultural targets as well. So everything basically that is important for functioning civilian life, right, to exist.
It is.
And so that's, to me, to much broader goals that are not just about so-called self-defense, in short, in summary.
Understood. But you use the word dystopian. I mean, Khaled, it is kind of dystopian, and it kind of makes some minds flash back to, if nothing ever happened to the United States after it illegally invaded Iraq, a country that had not ever attacked really the U.S. or any of its allies, and there was absolutely no consequences for it. I mean, is that exactly what we're really facing again? That there are no legal systems to deter states and militaries from doing their worst?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the problem, that the United States, first and foremost, has established this precedent for countries like Israel to follow in its footsteps. The irony, of course, is that President Biden himself said to Israel when reiterating his support for Israel's right to defend itself, said, "Don't make the same mistakes that we made," but then proceeded to make exactly those same mistakes. Israel has taken that as a green light to prosecute this war in any way that it sees fit. And I think it's important to note that this isn't normal. I mean, of course, American support and Western support for Israel is not new, but the kind of unqualified and unconditional support that we've seen throughout this war. Yes, we're told repeatedly that the United States is privately expressing its concerns and urging restraint, but it's clearly not having much impact in terms of how Israel's prosecuting this war. Yeah. Every time this administration has been asked, are there any red lines? They have repeatedly and explicitly said there are no red lines. When you combine that with no clear endgame, Israel wants to destroy Hamas, but no one understands exactly what that entails. you have, as Laila said, an open-ended forever war. And Israel clearly has few, if any, ceiling on the killing of civilians. This killing at this scale can continue more or less indefinitely, and probably will, unless there is outside intervention, particularly by the United States, to stop it.
Yeah. Just a quick correction. I should have said Iraq had never attacked the U.S. or any of its allies in the wake of September 11th, and that was when the justification was made to go in. But Tom, I just have one final question for you, because there is this case, and you are a journalist. So the case against filed by Reporters Without Borders for the killing of dozens of journalists. I'm not even sure what the actual total is now. Do you think that might have a different path to seek and find some success through litigation?
Well, I think, again, I think that certainly it's important symbolically. I think when it comes to actual practical effects, it's difficult to say. Like Khaled, I'm not a lawyer either, so there are people who are probably more well qualified to explain the ins and outs specifically of the process. But I think, again, going back to the symbolism and importance of these sort of things, they do represent a concerted campaign to put pressure to bring about that sort of accountability that is severely lacking in the international system, and whether it's the UN Security Council or U.S. law in general.
That will have to be the final word, because we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.